Hello, my History 461 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. I want to talk to you about your Week 1 readings and the themes around Week 1 because, going into our African American History 1865 to the present course. So, hi. Hi. Anyway, the main theme of this is trying to understand what different forms of racism are, how that racism really manifests itself in the United States, and what is now the United States over the course of the period leading up to about 1865, and what does that mean moving forward in terms of U.S. and African American history. Um, and so there are a number of different things that your readings cover. There's an awful lot that your readings do not cover, right? The biggest thing to really understand is that race is socially constructed, right? We all know all too well, based on the fact of different skin tones, different hair degradations, from 1A to 4C, et cetera, that, there's only one race. There's only Homo sapiens are one distinct species, period, right? There's not four or five or some different types of Homo sapiens in terms of pure genetics. Genetically speaking, we're 99.999999999, how many ever many nines you want to take it out to, maybe 12 or 13, the same. There's slight difference between 12 different genes or so that determines basically skin color in terms of how much melanin you have in your skin and your first couple layers of skin, to hair, how your hair can be kinky or nappy, whatever term you want to use, all the way to basically silky straight, or various variations within. Outside of that, there are actually no differences. But the process of the last several hundred years of Western dominance over the world, particularly parts of the global South, particularly, and also the Western Hemisphere, has led to this notion that while race is not a genetic thing in terms of different races among humanity, but it's socially constructed, and that's a term that Barbara Jean Fields comes up with in the mid 1980s, and it's still in use today. The social construction of race, which helps to help clearly define the lines of certain determinants around racism, which is to say, in other words, that because Europeans were the ones who essentially conquered the world roughly between the period of 1492 to about the middle of the 19th century, end of the 19th century, then by definition those people should be the ones ruling the world because they had some sort of advantage. And in this case, the advantage comes down to race. It comes down to being more intelligent, even being more athletic. There used to be a notion going all the way back to the mid-19th century, all the way to about 1920, 1930, that white folks, that people of European descent, were more athletically superior to other groups around the world. Obviously, that sounds ridiculous now. We're talking in 2022, but it wasn't so ridiculous 100 years ago. Same thing goes with intellectual superiority and those sorts of things. There used to be a whole movement around this, around something called craniology, to try to prove that white brains, that European brains, are bigger than the brains of those of people of African descent, those from Asia and other parts of the world. They would even chisel out parts of the cranial cavity that housed the brain in order for them to be able to prove that Europeans were superior to other groups. Of course, hollowing out brains means that your theory is obviously wrong, and you're just trying to prove a theory or a hypothesis on the basis of your own racist biases. So there's that. And so, but racism doesn't come to that sort of pseudoscientific um, um, manifestation for a while. Its primary manifestation is from a religious standpoint. It's sort of like putting the cart in front of the horse, right? The horse has been out the barn for a while, but you decide to put the cart in front of the horse to try to justify how the horse already left the barn. And the same thing happens with explaining the explanations around racism and the justifications of racism, really, in the 19th and 20th centuries. And those justifications start with religion. Oh, Christianity is more powerful than, you know, African religions, then these Mayan religions, then the Incan religion, then then Islam, then Buddhism, then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we're able to conquer the world. That's why we're able to enslave people of African descent and kidnap them, take them across the Atlantic Ocean, take them to the Caribbean, take them to Brazil, take them what's now the United States. Right? That used to be the original explanation. There's this whole thing around the sons of Ham, who's the son of Noah, and how after the flood, the sons of Ham are cursed. Those sons of Ham eventually become Egyptians. Those Egyptians are part of Africa. Therefore, all Africans are cursed. The problem with that is that that's not a literal interpretation. Even if that is a literal interpretation of the Bible, it's a little too literal because you don't really know who begat whom over an extremely long period of time, right? So, but neither here nor there. There are religious reasons, there are scientific reasons and rationales for, European superiority over other groups, particularly those of African descent, those who are of African diasporic descent. What's ironic here is that there's plenty of what we now call miscegenation going on while people are talking about all this. That is to say, that white men, mostly white men, are sexually involved with their African slaves, with African women. In most cases, because the relationship is wholly unequal, you have a slave owner dealing with enslaved people who are often born into slavery, with laws that protect what happens when they impregnate one of those slaves, meaning that the folks that are born from those enslaved women are themselves slaves upon birth, right? And so if they're slaves upon birth, you can create your own workforce by raping all of the women that you've already enslaved. And really only in the U.S. is this fully realized. In other parts of the Western Hemisphere where slavery exists throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, and even the 19th century, this happens too, but they're considered a different class for one, mulattoes or octoroons or quadroons for one thing. So they're considered different, and then oftentimes they're freed or they have servant status or they're fully freed because of that. Only in the United States is this possible because there are a lot of live childbirths and not nearly as much infant mortality in the U.S. as there are in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, quite frankly, because the climate's better, right? Climate's better, so it's not hot all the time. There's not as much disease. Therefore, these projects are able to survive, and therefore you can produce a workforce. But the laws allow for this too, because there is no class of octoroons, quadroons, mulattoes to get to be semi-free or free based on law, based on colonial American / English / British law from this period. That's one of the reasons why the number of African slaves grows to the point where by 1860, on the eve of the American Civil War in what's now the United States, um, there are 4 million. There are 4 million people who are of African descent who are enslaved by 1860. There are a lot of other reasons. We're going to talk about King Cotton and all that other stuff, and tobacco in the 17th and 18th century too. But that's the basis. This kind of, belief in the religious and eventually the pseudoscientific is what's used to justify what's already been happening for give or take 350 years in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly with colonial America / what becomes the United States for about 250 years. So there's that. But to think about it more in terms of where we move towards from 1865 to the present in this course, what you also have to keep in mind is that with the rise of Darwinism, the rise of the theory of evolution, there's a whole branch of things that branch off from that into what's known as the eugenics movement, with taking these highly scientific ideas and trying to apply them to human society, not just to life in general, but specifically to Homo sapiens. And in this case, in the American case, the idea is that instead of just trying, we just assume automatically that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, Anglo-Americans, WASPs, WASPs, WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, are the ones that are top in society. Therefore, they're the ones who are intellectually and athletically superior to all other groups who live in the United States, with those of African descent, Black Americans, or American Black folk considered, if not at the bottom, toward the bottom. Indigenous people, American Indians, Native Americans, are considered literally at the bottom. Indigenous people in general always at the bottom of these pseudoscientific scientific racism type hierarchies. In the middle are basically white immigrants, white ethnic immigrants who are not from Northern Europe, not from Scandinavia, not from Germany, not from France, not from the British Isles. The one exception, of course, from the British Isles who ends up in this white ethnic category are the Irish. The Irish are considered intellectually and athletically inferior to WASPs, and um, so are Poles, Italians, Greeks, Slovaks, all these other groups, Spaniards, right? All of these groups are considered intellectually and scientifically less than their WASP counterparts. Even less than that would be Asian and Asiatic groups, right? South Asians, Pakistani, Indian, and my Asian Indian in this case, right? Bangladeshi, um, Afghani, right? All these groups are considered intellectually inferior. Chinese, Korean, etc., right? And then all these indigenous groups, and their admixtures, the mixture of people of indigenous Americans, indigenous folks throughout the Americas with Spaniards and other groups, intellectually inferior. Jews, intellectually inferior to an extent, but at the same time, they don't really fit any category because they're white, but they're Semitic, but they practice a religion that's not Christian. So, depending on, so the result is that they're almost in a different category than all these other groups altogether. But what it ends up meaning is that you have a lot of groups that are European, but they're not considered white in the American context. And it takes the 20th century for white ethnic non-WASP whites to become white in this country. It takes, in fact, after World War II, after the Holocaust, after the cost of the eugenics movement in Germany, making it Nazi Germany, for the U.S. to start as a society customarily associating whiteness and being white to Italians, to Jews, to Greeks, and to these other white ethnic groups, right? And that's all part of the basis of scientific racism. That's all part of it. Um, but there's also the social Darwinist aspect of this, the survival of the fittest. And so the reason why African Americans in particular, no, regardless of how much white blood might be flowing through someone's veins and their genetics and so on and so forth, they're considered at the bottom of society as a group because they're not WASP, because they can't be gradually made white, right? They can't be fully white because of the one drop rule. If you have one drop of black blood, you are black, no matter how white your ancestry might be. So, so the result of that is that you can use social Darwinism, you can use scientific racism to explain away the vast inequalities within American society. Why are blacks relegated to disproportionate amounts of poverty, of sickness, of infant mortality rates, to shorter lifespans? Well, because they're inferior to WASP. That's literally been the explanation for it's for most of American history, but from a scientific or pseudoscientific standpoint, for about the last 150, 180 years or so. So that's what you're looking at when you look at all these readings for this week. It's to sort of introduce you to, you know, structural racism, the racism that exists across all institutions of American society, institutional racism, how you can build institutions out of that racism based on laws, based on customs, and so on and so forth. There's interpersonal racism where people express racism through 1,000 cuts, through the microaggressions that they make toward each other, right? Towards one another. Yes, some of that can be unintentional, but if you live in a society that is naturally a racist society, it's kind of like the air you breathe, right? It's like being part of the Matrix. For those of you who know what the movie The Matrix was all about, it's like being part. Once you're plugged in, you can't really distinguish between what you intended to do and your sort of natural tendency, because you live in a racist society, to express racist ideas, racist thoughts, racist epithets towards people, right? And then there, of course, there's the internalized racism from living in all these layers of racism, this lattice work of racism. So that's really what you're looking at for this week, before we even delve into what African Americans had to deal with at the end of the Civil War, even with emancipation, even with Reconstruction on its way, that they would face all these layers and would continue to face these layers from 1865 literally to today. So